podcast where we talk to smart people, but not necessarily done by smart people?
That is an awesome question.
This one goes down probably on one of my top 5.
Hey, I like nutrition. I like to eat food.
This is the coolest thing ever. We're going to do this forever.
I wish I paid more attention in that class.
You know, I'm going to be honest, I don't understand that. As a man, I don't get it.
Welcome to smartpeoplepodcast.com.
Hello and welcome to Smart People Podcast, conversations that satisfy your curious mind. I'm Chris Stemp. Today, we're going to try not to frighten you with how the NSA is hacking all of your stuff. As has been made public recently by the likes of Edward Snowden, you know, our information's not always safe, but how bad is that? And where did it start? And why is it happening? And where is it happening? That's what we need to know. So we went to the guy who knows all about it. This week we are interviewing Shane Harris. Shane is the author of The Watchers, The Rise of America's Surveillance State, which won the New York Public Library's Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism. It was also named one of the best books of 2010 by The Economist. Shane also recently came out with a book on November 11th, so as of this recording, just a few days ago. His newest book is titled At War, The Rise of the Military Internet Complex. At War is really interesting. It talks about the new version of warfare, right? Like how this all came about during the Iraq War, how we used it to save countless American lives, how we were forced into this situation because we are now fighting wars that we've never dealt with before. Information is the new gold. If you know who's calling who, where they are, what they're saying, what websites they're going on, you can track a lot of these things down and prevent the attacks before they happen. So that's what we talk with Shane about. We also talk about how they can look at your information on Facebook and Google and Gmail and all that. Shane's also a writer at The Daily Beast. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, the Washington Post, etc., etc. Going to get into the interview with Shane here in a minute. As always, we appreciate when you reach out and connect with us at Smart People Podcast. Sign up for our newsletter where we send out some of our favorite parts of the show, quotes, interviews, and the like. You can do that at smartpeoplepodcast.com. Also, if you could leave us a review on iTunes, we very much appreciate your support. We do this for you and because it's fun, obviously. All right, here it is, our interview with Shane Harris. All right, Shane, well, thanks so much for being on the show. And first, I have to ask, you know, for more than a decade, you've covered national security, intelligence, cybersecurity. Your last book was The Watchers, The Rise of America's Surveillance State. And now you just released At War, The Rise of the Military Internet Complex. So with that said, do you ever use the internet, a smartphone, a computer, email? Because I wouldn't if I were you.
Right. Yeah, I should probably stay off it. Right.
Yeah.
No, it's funny. I think that in researching and reporting on these subjects, I've become at first I became a lot more paranoid, and then I think I felt like I learned more about how to try and stay safe online and the things that you can do to protect your communications and whatnot. And I've taken some pretty basic steps in that area. Like I use a password locker, I use two-step authentication on a lot of things, and all these things, if they sound like mumbo jumbo to your listeners, they're basically like the equivalent of putting better door locks on your house and and just being more sort of conscientious. But yeah, it is something I think about though, and I think journalists especially in the United States have a couple of things to worry about. I mean, one is that there's obviously a real crackdown on a lot of our sources lately, so you worry about communicating with people and whether or not you could be getting them into trouble by communicating with them. And then, I've written a lot about foreign intelligence agencies and what they're doing, trying to steal information from companies and from people in the U.S. And journalists have been targets of foreign intelligence agencies. So it's something that I'm aware of, but I've just kind of had to come to terms with it and try to be smart about how I operate online. And and just take the best steps I can to protect myself.
Yeah, I mean, after reading your book, I actually felt a little less dorky about the fact that I have a piece of masking tape covering my camera on my laptop.
Right. You're exactly.
I really, because people are like,
You're
what is
You're
this? What are you so worried about? And I'm like, well, you should just read this book, buddy.
You won't feel so paranoid. It's not paranoid if they're watching you.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, though, and the two-step verification, I recently did that for my Gmail account because it did get hacked and it was a big pain. But I feel like, especially after reading your book and understanding how just intelligent and evolved these hackers are, can we really escape it? Or is it just make it a little bit more difficult and they'll go after people that matter?
I think that's one way of looking at it. I mean, a persistent hacker who wants to get into someone's system is going to do whatever they have to get there, and no system is impenetrable. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, we had news that J.P. Morgan, the bank, got penetrated by hackers that could have gone. It sounds like they could have gone a lot farther into the bank's systems than they did, and this scared a lot of people in the security industries and in the agencies as well, because banks are supposed to have the best security. So if they can go after banks and they can get into bank data, does that mean that, the rest of us are sort of, hopelessly defenseless? I think that you just have to take the most prudent steps that you can, but it's never going to be perfect. And if somebody really, really wants to get into your stuff, they're probably going to find a way to do it. Now, I mean, I guess you can comfort yourself to some degree. It's sort of small comfort. It seems like a lot of the financial criminals out there who have been trying to do things like steal people's account data and credit card information are going after banks and large merchants and seem to be targeting, maybe targeting individuals less. It doesn't mean that they're not. There's still a lot of fraudsters out there. But, hopefully if you take some basic steps and just are smart about not opening attachments that you don't know where they came from and being careful what websites that you go to, I think you minimize your risk, but I don't think you can eliminate it.
You mentioned banks are supposed to have the best security. I would think that really the best security should be government security.
Yeah.
Is that not the case?
Well, it depends on what part of government we're talking about. I mean, government as a whole, it's difficult to talk about it that way. The Defense Department and the intelligence agencies have generally very, very good security on a lot of their networks, and some of their networks are not even connected to the internet. That doesn't make it foolproof, but generally speaking, they've done a good job. But then there are civilian agencies that are woefully underprotected. In the past, even the Homeland Security Department, which is nominally the agency that's supposed to work with civilian agencies to defend their networks, has received very poor grades from Congress on its security. So across the board, it's a very, very mixed bag. But generally speaking, the national security agencies are pretty good. And I think that they've learned how to take really sort of stringent measures. I mean, there was an incident a number of years ago where a piece of malicious software found its way onto a network used by Central Command, U.S. Central Command, which was a scary event because that network was not connected to the internet. So no one knows precisely how it got in. It was probably on a remote thumb drive, and probably somebody inadvertently infected a computer with it, and then it got loose in the network. And then that led to things like banning thumb drives and banning secondary media from being attached to computers. So the security agencies have had to take a lot of steps to really harden their systems. And if you were working in an office at the NSA, it would not feel remotely like a regular office. There would be a lot of extra steps in place that would prevent you from hooking your iPhone, for instance, up to your computer. You probably couldn't do that. And that's just the world that they live in. Those are the steps they've had to take.
Yeah. So, one of the things that grabbed me about your book is I love the play on words of the military internet complex versus the military industrial complex. For our listeners who probably haven't read it because it just came out, what did you mean by that? What is this military internet complex?
So the military internet complex is an alliance between the military and the intelligence agencies, and principally the NSA, and a number of important companies in the U.S. to include large defense contractors, big communications companies, including the ones that run the internet backbones in the U.S., and a lot of your sort of larger, more important technology companies like Google and Facebook and Yahoo. And when I speak of this as an alliance, it's a fairly tenuous one. There are cases where all these sides are working together, and there are times when actually they're at cross purposes. But essentially, what this complex is about is trying to defend cyberspace from malicious intruders and defend information and infrastructure, physical things that are connected to the internet, including our most important infrastructures like our power grid, financial systems. But also this complex has been directed at and oriented at offensive activity in cyberspace, fighting cyber wars, if you like. And how it came together is because the government, while it wants to operate in cyberspace as sort of a domain of warfare, as the military sometimes calls it, doesn't own the internet. It doesn't control the internet as a piece of hardware. 85% of the infrastructure, the network infrastructure, the tubes and the pipes in this country are in private hands. They're owned by companies. They're owned by ISPs. They're owned by technology firms. And so in order to defend that space and operate in it, as the military and the intelligence agencies want to do, they need the assistance and the cooperation of companies. So that's where this alliance is coming together. It's largely for the purpose of defending that network and also being able to operate offensively in it.
Well, what's scary about that, and you cover this, is that these communications enterprises such as Google, AT&T, Verizon, Facebook, really anything we use to get on the internet, share information outside of our immediate community is open for government analysis, right?
Under lawful circumstances, yes. The government has the ability to come in and collect certain kinds of information. They can collect what's known as metadata, which is not the contents of your communication, but the records of who you're calling and who you're in contact. We know now, thanks to disclosures from Edward Snowden, that NSA has been collecting phone metadata on Americans, that it has collected email and internet metadata as well. There are some important limitations on this. I mean, the NSA or the FBI cannot monitor and read your email or listen to your phone call without a warrant. They have to have a specific individual warrant to do that. But what we are seeing is that through this military internet complex, companies are monitoring sort of the traffic that is moving over their network and looking for signs of malicious activity, potential intrusions, and sort of at this kind of metadata level, if you like. They are sharing in many cases some of that information with the government, and the government is in turn sharing information that it's seeing as well. So you have kind of a flow of data going between these different entities that is not precisely spying and surveillance, but it is sort of knowledge and intelligence about what's on that network. And the NSA can't do that without the cooperation of the companies. That's why they're so vitally important to that enterprise.
So we spoke with Jared Dean, and he was telling us how there's so much data being created that companies are trying to find ways to sort through this data. And you're talking about just maybe consumer data on Amazon or Netflix. How much data can the government, even the best people in the world, really sort through for somebody like myself to actually ever care?
I think that it's certainly impossible for human beings to analyze and process all of that data on their own. I mean, we're talking about, overwhelming amounts of information and it coming through in real time. What the intelligence agencies have tried to get good at and better at, and the companies as well, is trying to understand where are the places that they need to look and sort of what are the signatures they need to be watching for. So, for example, if a bank is coming under attack, and by attack I mean let's take something called the denial of service attack, which happened a few years ago, where elements believed to be in Iran hijacked these large clusters of computers in data centers and used them to send huge volumes of internet traffic at the websites of several American banks, which caused the banks to crash because they sort of drowned in the data. If you are the NSA and you're monitoring this and you see sort of where this is coming from in the network, that's something that in the future you're going to incorporate into your defensive strategy. So you're going to be looking for these kinds of attacks, or perhaps coming from these addresses. They try and find essentially leads and information that can help them narrow down and focus on what they should be looking for. That said, I mean, you're talking about some of these companies are probed thousands of times a day. The Pentagon's networks, they will tell you, are probed thousands of times a day. And you need automated systems to some degree to be able to scan all of this to try and find out, is it loaded with malicious software? Does it match some kind of what they'll say, a threat signature that tells us that this could be something that we need to watch out for? That process is largely being automated. And the government has spent a vast number of years developing automated systems to do that on their own networks, and have been looking for ways to share that with people in the private sector too. So this really, when we're talking about scanning all this volume and analyzing it for signs of malicious activity, this is largely being done by computers, by people.
And, I want to get into kind of how this affects international communities and relations, and that war, obviously, as you discussed. But before getting into that, remaining on this, how it affects the individual, I get into this conversation sometimes with my dad. A lot of people of maybe older generations talk about not wanting to give up their information, right? Wanting to keep a lot of this close to the chest. And then you have my generation and even younger that will put anything anywhere and just don't care. I mean, I pretty much don't care what I put out there. And I'm sure you hear this a lot. If I don't have anything to hide, and as you explain, this type of analysis, this data mining, hacking, does help us in terms of finding terrorist threats and things. Should I just look the other way? Because oftentimes my dad will say, yeah, but the government gets a lot of things wrong. And I mean, you see it over and over and over again, right? Like now they're just letting people in the White House. We don't know what's going on. So maybe I don't want them with my data. Maybe I'm just too trusting. It's generational. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is generational. I mean, your father probably, I don't know how old he is, but chances are he remembers a time in the 1960s and the 1970s when the FBI and the NSA were caught up in a number of scandals where it was found that the government was illegally monitoring the communications of political dissidents and war activists and people like Martin Luther King and even some Supreme Court justices. And this was a huge scandal that in the 1970s led to a number of the laws that we still have on the books that restrict what the government is able to do with your information and when it is authorized to monitor you, to spy on you. That I think that memory was searing, not just for people in your dad's generation, but for the whole generation of people who then grew up in the intelligence agencies. And you'll meet people who kind of joined the FBI or the NSA in the sort of late 70s period after all of these scandals happened. And what they'll tell you is that it was always drilled into them: we do not spy on Americans. We do not monitor Americans for political speech. We do not monitor anything that is protected by the First Amendment. That prohibition starts to get strained after the 9/11 attacks. And the reason for that is because, of course, the terrorists who attacked on 9/11 were in the United States and were using this communications infrastructure that for a long time the agencies had said, no, you can't monitor that because it involves Americans' personal information. So I think that the kind of the reflexive tendency to say like we shouldn't trust the government stems from that period of time when they did abuse that level of trust. And 9/11, we've seen a lot of these rules bent and in some cases even broken. And I think for a lot of people that said, see, look, this is proof that you have to constantly be keeping tabs on what the government is doing with your information, that even a generation of people who were raised up in those agencies not to monitor U.S. personal information after 9/11, a lot of those constraints were lifted and the American public didn't know about it. So I think there's just a healthy skepticism that I've had to exercise too in writing about the intelligence agencies. And look, I use Facebook, I use Twitter, I put a lot of my information out there too. In my generation, I'm 38, is far more comfortable doing that. But I think you can kind of be somewhere in the middle, right? You can feel comfortable putting out the amount of information about yourself that you want to, using your privacy settings on Facebook to decide who sees it. But at the same time, be skeptical about what the government is doing with your information. And remembering too that the government has the ability to arrest people. The government has law enforcement authority. That's what makes them different, I think, than a company like Facebook, where yes, you're giving them lots of information about yourself that they might mine for marketing purposes, but nobody from Facebook is going to have the authority to lock you up.
Right. No, that's a good point. And I mean, I understand that side of the argument. I think the skepticism that you mentioned is definitely warranted. You don't want to start down that path because you don't know where it always leads. So maybe you search for something you perhaps shouldn't have on the internet, but maybe it's just an interest of yours. You don't want that all of a sudden to raise these red flags, and now you're listened to and screened at the airport and everything like that. So there is a boundary there.
Yeah, I think there's a boundary, and people are becoming all the time more and more fluent in this technology and understanding, what not to put on social media. I mean, there are people who are in their mid-20s who have had to go through the process of graduating from college and getting a job in the past 3 or 4 years. Probably have experience with, having embarrassing pictures of themselves on Facebook, right? And maybe you won't do that again. So I think there's just sort of a natural learning process about oversharing, and if you want to factor in, to your decision not to post too much information, that you don't want it to be available to somebody in the government, hey, that's a pretty good reason to be careful about what you post too.
Yeah, it's true. Although I've often said this to people, they're like, oh, those pictures on Facebook or whatever could come back to haunt you. And I said, by the time I get to a position where they can haunt me, everyone will have this, so I'm not worried. And I mean, we see it already, right?
You'll be in the same boat, yeah.
I mean, no longer are you going to have presidents that say they didn't smoke weed, because they did. I'm telling you that. So
of course, we're all in the same boat, and it's all sins are forgiven the more that more people are committing them, I guess.
Yeah, especially in politics these days.
Yeah, exactly. Standards have changed.
Yeah. So, all right, let's get into a lot more of even what your book is about and a lot of your work is about. How this revolution really came to be through warfare. Could you give us a little bit of a history lesson on when this all really went into play? And when I say this, actually, what is this? What are we doing? And how is it changing the landscape of war?
Sure. Well, the first chapter of the book, which I think is a good starting point for this, looks at how the military and the NSA in particular used offensive cyber operations or cyber warfare in Iraq. And the project there was that the NSA managed to build an infrastructure in Iraq that could monitor every phone call and every email and every text message that was being sent in the country. And once they had that information, they were able to pinpoint the location of terrorists and insurgent fighters in the country, the people who were planting roadside bombs and who were attacking U.S. troops and who were leading the insurgency there. This was one of the first times that on a really large scale, the military and the intelligence agencies went out and actively hacked into their adversaries' networks, doing things like not just monitoring their phone calls, but sending them fake text messages to lure them into traps, implanting spyware on websites and forums that are frequented by jihadis and other terrorists. It really, hacking them, essentially hacking their networks, getting into them, manipulating them, spying on them. And it worked with really lethal efficiency. The thousands of fighters were removed from the battlefield because the NSA was able to get into these communications networks and pinpoint the locations of these individuals. One guy I write about in the book, a guy named Bob Stasio, who was a young lieutenant in the Army who did a lot of this work, he likened it to, I don't know if you remember the HBO show The Wire. I don't know if you were a fan of The Wire.
I was going to ask you about that. No joke. I had that written down because it's one of my favorite shows of all time. And you kind of see what they were doing with like burner phones and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so Bob modeled himself after Lester. Lester Freeman was the sort of, the veteran kind of quiet detective on the show, who's the guy who he's not out there on the streets so much, he's sitting in the office and he's dissecting all of the call records on the burner phones that the drug dealers are using, and he's using that to build a diagram of their network and to figure out who actually runs the gang and who are the important people. And Bob Stasio did the same kind of thing. He just took the same sort of principles and ideas and he applied them towards what happened in Iraq. And he's a really good example of this kind of generational thinking. I mean, he was somebody who was in his late 20s when he goes over to Iraq. He's totally fluent with technology. He's grown up with it. All this to him seems intuitive and natural. Like, well, of course you can use people's communications to figure out where they are. I mean, that's just obvious, right? Well, it wasn't obvious to an earlier generation of people, at least not on the same kind of intimate human level. So a lot of what I write about in the book is how people like Bob, have kind of become this new vanguard of kind of hybrid soldiers and spies, that there are people who are becoming really adept at breaking into computer networks and doing that not just for the purposes of gathering information, but for knowing how you can physically locate people, which is something that is going to be done a lot more in wars that we fight in the future. The military is right now planning for a future in which cyber attacks and cyber intelligence gathering takes its place just alongside air power and sea power and land power in the wars that we fight in the future. And Iraq is really the first place where I think that concept was tested.
Now, was it Iraq the breeding ground for that because of the type of war? Basically, this terrorist type warfare where you can hide in the mountains and move. It's just not the stand in front of each other and shoot, and we know where the battlefield is. Is that why it became so prevalent during this war?
I think that was part of it. I mean, what motivated intelligence officials and ultimately President Bush, who signed off on this program, was that we were having a lot of trouble fighting a conventional war with an insurgent network. I mean, it was challenging our notions of what warfare is. And the people at the NSA realized that the insurgents, being a network themselves, had this vulnerability that we could exploit, which was their communication system. And in some ways, this kind of goes back to, for hundreds of years, what intelligence gathering has been about: spying on your enemy, intercepting his messages, figuring out what he's about to do. They took it, though, to many levels higher in Iraq. And I think that it was a combination of an adversary that was highly adaptive. We needed to be adaptive as well. But also, this was sort of a bit of a right place at the right time. The director of national intelligence at the time was a guy named Mike McConnell, who had run the NSA in the mid-1990s and actually started its first, what was then called the Information Warfare Unit. So sort of the early days of what we're talking about, which when it was sort of still largely theoretical. And then the guy at the time running the NSA was a man named Keith Alexander, who was very much a student of these kinds of techniques and a believer in the power of them. So the fact that these two men were in place at very senior levels in the U.S. intelligence community at the time was also a factor here. They were the ones who brought these ideas forward to the president and said, we think that this has real potential. This could help us turn the tide of the war. And ultimately it did. They were right.
So is it safe to say we, for the most part, we didn't necessarily invent this idea, but we were the first to master it? When I say we, obviously, Americans, even though this is listened globally, and I will talk about its global implications as well. But
sure. I mean, I think that it's fair to say that it had never, this kind of cyber intelligence gathering with an aim towards integrating it into combat, and I call that cyber warfare. We were the first to do this on this scale, definitely. There have been some examples of it that you'll find here and there, like when Russian forces invaded Georgia many years ago. There was a cyber element to that. They used some computer hacking techniques to disrupt communications in Georgia. The Russians are believed to have been behind a large denial of service attack that was launched on Estonia many years ago. But those were sort of, kind of almost like harassment operations. This is a case where this was fully integrated into the war plan, where we were covering the entire country, sucking up these communications, breaking the networks, manipulating people with information, taking what we learned about the location of fighters, giving that to combat forces on the ground, who then either arrested or killed them. And that cycle just kept repeating itself day after day for many months. So I think that, we can lay claim to that kind of sort of pioneering that kind of warfare.
Well, and then I think as you explain this idea of cyber warfare, hacking, really how beneficial it can be for the hacker to get into these systems has now gone global. There are, China's is doing a lot in that space, and now it's become warfare without any boots on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's sort of pervasive global campaigns by many countries of espionage. What China is doing is taking thousands and thousands of hackers working, around the clock and trying to basically break into as many corporations and as many government agencies in the U.S. as they possibly can. And what they're principally interested in is not just figuring out what our government is up to. That's sort of classic espionage. But the Chinese are very interested in getting proprietary information and trade secrets and plans and internal communications from companies in this country in order to give them to companies in China so that they have a competitive advantage in the global marketplace. So this is, a classic sort of form of industrial espionage or economic espionage. But they're using these same hacking techniques that are used to steal information are the hacking techniques that you would use to get into a computer and manipulate the physical devices that it controls. So if you know how to get into a system and steal someone's data, you probably know how to get into a system that runs a power turbine as well that you could cause to break and to just shut down the power on a portion of the grid. That's what actually has U.S. intelligence officials deeply concerned about China in particular, is that right now they've limited their activities to espionage, but that it would be very easy for them to ratchet it up a notch and take it into the realm of actually trying to break physical infrastructure that is connected to these networks.
When I think about that, and as much as the world has become segmented and we get to, due to our geographic location, oftentimes enjoy the barriers that we have. The world is global, and so what affects our economy directly impacts theirs. When we had the real estate boom or the bust or the tech bust, I mean, we saw those implications globally. Why would somebody like China want to essentially demolish a lot of our infrastructure and really cause these disruptions when they themselves own so much of our stuff?
Yeah, you're right. And this is, this is what people will point out, and I think rightly so. When we talk about, the scenario I just outlined, what if China were to go from espionage to breaking, shutting down a piece of the power grid or launching an attack that caused a panic in the financial sector? They have a strong incentive not to do those things. And I think that's why they haven't really escalated from the level of espionage up to those kinds of attacks. Because as you say, they have no interest in taking out the banking system or large banks because they're one of our biggest investors and lenders.
Right.
So it'll come back on them. And it's actually something that, U.S. officials have tried without much success to persuade their counterparts in China, which is to say, look, the things that you guys are doing in terms of stealing, secrets from us in our corporations, you're not acting like an economic power. These are not things that you can do in a global economy. You have to abide by certain rules and certain standards, and this is not acceptable. The Chinese look at that and they think that we're kidding ourselves. Why wouldn't they use this apparatus for their own advantage? Why wouldn't they take this information rather than innovate products on their own? It's a different way of looking at economies and markets, and ultimately I think it's a different kind of morality as well.
And given that, I don't want to sit on our high horse because I don't know this for a fact, but I'd imagine we're doing something along those lines.
Yeah, we are. We know now for a fact, because we've seen the documents of it, that Snowden released, that the U.S. does in fact hack into foreign corporations and steal information from them and steal information about their plans and their operations. But the difference here, and a lot of people think this is a different a distinction without much of a meaningful difference, is that we do not turn around, at least officials say we do not, turn around and give that to our companies. So for instance, we don't hack into the computers of Airbus and give that information that we find to Boeing.
Yeah.
The Chinese will hack into, an American manufacturer and give it to the competitor in China. What we say we do with that information is we use that to inform our policymaking, our strategy. But if you really kind of think about it, well, what does that mean? So if we are learning information about where Venezuela plans to drill for oil, and we start building that into our thinking about negotiations and about energy policy, well, that information is probably going to trickle out in the interactions that we have with American corporations. So we may not be directly handing over secrets that we stole, but our knowledge and our insights that we gain from that process, I think, does find its way over to the private sector. That's a very gray and kind of squishy process, and it's not as direct as China. But, it's not economic espionage, but it's, espionage informs our decision-making on a number of levels, and sometimes indirectly, I think.
Sure. Well, getting back to one of the things I know you do a lot of research on is the future of war. Where do you see this going? How do you see this playing out in the next decade and then decades and century?
Well, I don't think that we're going to replace conventional boots on the ground type war or air wars with cyber war. I don't think that we'll find our just firing off malware at China and they fire it back, but we never actually have a military exchange. I think what's going to happen is that cyber warfare is going to take its place alongside other forms of conventional war, and that in the next decade, what you'll see is that the military will train its personnel in computer network operations, in hacking, and in cyber defense, in cyber warfare, the same way they train people to work in the infantry, the same way they train pilots, the same way they train people to work on submarines. It will kind of become a discipline within the military. And when we fight wars in the future, and particularly if we fight large-scale ones, cyber will just be another weapon in the arsenal, just like it'll be a system like a tank or an aircraft or a missile. And I think that it will drive a lot of our planning for the way that the military in this country is going to look. We may see that we have a greater dependence on cyber, and we start to draw down some of our dependence on air war, for instance. I mean, there'll be sort of a mixture that we'll have to get right. What's interesting to me and instructive is that cybersecurity and spending on cyber warfare is really the only part of the defense budget that's actually growing. The defense budget's being slashed right now. It's under a lot of strain. But cyber is a place where there's a lot of new spending. And I think what that shows you is that this is going to become both sort of a discipline in its own right, but also there will be cyber dimensions to other forms of warfare as well. So for the new planes that we're building, you have to have the ability to defend those aircraft because they are basically flying software platforms. Modern weaponry that we're using in war is all networked. I mean, soldiers go into battle today wearing gear that literally is networked communications gear. That all has to be protected. So cyber sort of plays a realm in all of the other forms of warfare that we've have a long tradition of.
Well, Shane, this stuff is really interesting. And your book, the newest book, just came out a couple days ago as of this recording. So I think it was the 11th that came out, right?
That's right.
Yep, November 11th. And it's At War, The Rise of the Military Internet Complex. I love that title. But it's great. It's a good read in terms of, I read solely nonfiction, and I beat myself up dragging through some books. So I love, and a lot of the people we interview, getting books that are well written, easy to follow, but chock full of just really good lessons and things we should know about as people on this planet. So great job on that. I wish you the best of luck. Where else, is there anywhere else that you could send our listeners? Do you write elsewhere, other things you want to let them know about?
Sure, absolutely. And thanks for saying that about the book. I appreciate it. You can find me on Twitter at Shane Harris. I also am a senior correspondent for The Daily Beast, thedailybeast.com, where I write about a lot of these issues, so people can find me there as well. And those are probably the places where you're most likely to run into me on a daily basis in cyberspace.
or we can Google you or Facebook you, but just make sure you put up your firewalls and clear your cookies and all that good stuff, right?
Right, exactly. So everyone will be screened.
That's right. Well, Shane, thank you so much for taking time out to talk with me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
Okay.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey there, and welcome back to Smart People Podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Shane Harris. Speaking of the interview, with the interview in the news and all of the hacking that went on with Sony and the allegations of North Korea, cyber warfare is definitely going to be in the forefront of our lives. So this is just something new that we're going to have to deal with. And I hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Shane. I actually did find it fascinating, and I know that we're just scratching the surface with it. So it'll be really interesting to see how we as the United States reacts to this. Hope you guys enjoyed the show. If you did, please head over to iTunes or Stitcher and leave a review and rating there. We truly do appreciate when you guys do that. It lets us know what you think of the show, as well as putting those ratings out there really gets some attention for the show. And we really do appreciate when you guys take the time to provide some feedback and ratings of the show. As we close up the holiday season here, I want to remind you that you can still shop through our Amazon link. Just head over to smartpeoplepodcast.com and click on the Amazon banner, or you can use our direct link, smartpeoplepodcast.com/Amazon, and that just allows us to get a little kickback from Amazon when you make your purchases. It's at no cost to you. It's completely on Amazon, and it's a big help to the show to keep us up and running, and we really do appreciate when you guys make your purchases through Amazon. If you want to reach out to Chris or I, don't forget that you can email us at smartpeoplepodcast@gmail.com, or you can send us a message on Twitter at smartpeoplepod. We love hearing from you guys, love getting guest suggestions or just feedback for the show. Really do like having conversations with you guys, so go ahead and write in. All right, guys. Well, thank you again for listening to another episode of Smart People Podcast, and we will see you next week.